Everything had to be transported nearly 1,000 kilometers from Reich territory. My supply officer, who had brought up ammunition, rations, and spare parts with his transport column, told me that depots were slowly being set up and that rail links were being restored. But time was running out. We were still more than 200 kilometers from Moscow, our first objective, not to mention the major objective, the Ural Mountains, which lay some 2,000 kilometers further cast. On a visit to Divisional HQ, I learned something about the general situation. Our entry into Russia had been delayed by nearly 2 months because Hitler had to help the Italians in Greece and subsequently deal with growing partisan activity in the Balkans. To the south of us, Guderian was thrusting forward in the direction of Kaluga, barely 200 kilometers south of Moscow, with the aim of cutting the road connecting Moscow and the Crimea at Tula. The Russian winter was at the door, and the Wehrmacht was not prepared for it, let alone equipped. Hitler and the High Command seemed to have made no provision at all for a delay until winter. Moscow, said our divisional commander, had to be, encircled as quickly as possible, and its lines of communication to the east cut off. This war is going to last longer than we would like, said our commander, summing up his sober assessment of the situation. The days of the blitzkrieg are over. On either side of the Moscow trail tank units formed up for the attack on Vyazma. Against bitter resistance, the town was enveloped to the north and south, and on its eastern fringe, this pocket too was closed. Losses on both sides were heavy. My faithful Beck was also wounded, thank goodness only lightly, but enough for a wound badge. Once again, the pocket had to be mopped up by the infantry, following slowly and weary from its long marches on foot. Panzer units provided cover to the east. Reconnaissance was pushed onto the east and northeast. At every point, we came upon heightened resistance. And yet Moscow lay within reach. After the mopping up of the Vyazma pocket, we asked ourselves how Stalin kept producing new divisions, when 1 million Russians, if not more according to our reckoning, had fallen into captivity, and whence came the thousands of tanks and guns. We heard from a captured Russian officer that in a lightning action, Stalin had evacuated the industrial concerns around Moscow and those further south on the Volga to the east as far as Urals, a unique logistical achievement. We stuck without change to our plan of taking Moscow. The fall of Moscow, the heart of the vast empire, should and would have a significant psychological effect on the morale of the people and the Russian army. While in the north, Leningrad was being encircled, and in the south an attack to the east was being mounted along a wide front toward Kharkov and the Crimea. Our Panzer Corps was supposed to push forward to the northeast, into the area between Moscow and Kalinin, a town on the upper reaches of the Volga, with the aim crossing the Moscow-Volga Canal and thrusting into the rear of Moscow from the north. It was late autumn, before we had fought our way forward through trackless terrain and against bitter resistance to Volokholamsk, a town about 100 kilometers from Moscow. There, the terrain formed a natural line of defense, which was well manned by the Russians. Once again, long pauses ensued, fuel and ammunition had to be brought forward. My 2 battalions received replacements for the casualties. The young ones had first to get used to the hard conditions. At home, all they had heard about was the tremendous forward drive, and that Russia would be defeated in the near future. Meantime, October had come, and we formed up anew for the attack, broke the Russian lines near Volokholamsk, and advanced on Klin, a town on the important Moscow-Kalinin-Leningrad highway. After heavy fighting, Klin was taken. With that, Moscow was cut off from Leningrad. Another panzer division reached and took Kalinin. The infantry had moved up meanwhile, and took over the securing of this critical connecting road. I was lying just east of Klin. The Moscow-Volga Canal was still about 50 kilometers away. I was summoned to division. Luck, you will assemble shortly before dawn with both battalions and try to take intact the bridge over the canal at Yakroma. If that comes off, you form Bridgehead on the east bank and wait for the bulk of the division to arrive. You must anticipate powerful counterattacks. Winter is upon us. We must gain our objectives before then. The divisional adjutant took me aside. Luck, strictly between ourselves, you have been asked for by Rommel to take over the 3rd Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion in North Africa. There's an order to that effect from personnel. The general won't release you at this juncture. He will negate the order and not mention it to you. But I wanted you to know about it. I was astonished. How did Rommel come to pick me in particular? There must have been enough commanders available at home in the so-called officer reserve. To exchange Moscow for Tripoli struck me as breathtaking. But as yet, nothing was official. Only one thing was immediately before us: the next arduous attack. The following morning we assembled while it was still dark. It was already distinctly cold. With masked headlights, which gave only a crack of light, so that the men at the front and back could at least recognize each other, we felt our way forward along byways. Shortly after dawn, we reached the canal. On the east bank lay the little town of Yakroma. Of the enemy, there was neither sight nor sound. The advance patrols found the bridge intact and at once drove over to the east bank. Suddenly we heard some rather haphazard fire from the town, and then the sound of motors going away. I followed up immediately with both battalions and occupied the town, which had been abruptly abandoned by the Russians. I gave out my orders. The town is to be searched at once. The motorcycle battalion, with the support of scout cars, will see to securing the outskirts of the town. The bridgehead is to be held at all costs. I asked my adjutant to find a house in the center of the town in which to set up my command post and from where I could report to division. "Welcome to a Russian breakfast," said my adjutant, coming up to me and pointing to a house. To my surprise, we found there a table laid with samovar, bread, butter, eggs, and naturally cured ham. "What a nice reception," I cried. At which the proprietor of the little inn appeared and explained that he had laid breakfast there for the Russian commander. But he had had to leave it all behind when we had appeared in the little town so unexpectedly. Hungry and highly delighted, we sat down to breakfast. That breakfast was to play a surprising role for me later. Our little bridgehead was not attacked, strangely enough. The division moved up and extended it. Tanks and artillery were brought into action. The way forward, south and southeast to Moscow, seemed to be open. In our rear, the infantry closed up and took charge of securing the road connecting Moscow and Leningrad. Much later in Russian captivity, I met Kobe's Witthaus, and when I saw him again, in 1984, he told me I too was close to Moscow that winter. Our 35th Infantry Division was thrown into the campaign for that road from Kalinin to Moscow. I managed to penetrate with a patrol right into the suburbs of Moscow. There, I was cut off, but we were able to remain hidden for 2 days, until we were forced to withdraw by a Russian counterattack. That, therefore, was how close the German Wehrmacht came to its first objective. In this, our panzer units in the southwest, which were pressing forward vigorously, helped considerably. At the end of October, winter set in. From one day to the next, temperatures sank far below the freezing point. It began to snow in unimaginable quantities. It made life difficult for us. The one advantage was that the muddy and dusty roads were now transformed into hard frozen pistes. The snow evened out the ruts and ridges. The Wehrmacht, as mentioned, was quite unprepared for winter. Along the whole north and central front, almost all troop movements were smothered by the snow. Worst off were the infantry units and our motorcycles, since they were unprotected. To the dismay of us all, the Russians brought in well-equipped ski divisions from Siberia and the Far East. Well camouflaged by their white top suits, Russian infantry filtered almost inaudibly and invisibly through our lines of defense. We sensed catastrophe and thought of Napoleon's fate. At home, reports from Russia were so alarming that measures were immediately introduced to get winter equipment to the front. Goebbels called upon the population to help the brave men at the front by voluntary gifts. German fellow citizens, give voluntarily your skis, winter clothing, furs, antsy warm underwear for your sons and husbands at the front. As we learned from home, a huge gift campaign began at once. From collecting points, the gifts were passed on up the line. As might have been expected, however, the supply offices and depots were managed so bureaucratically, for the most part, that they were not in a position to distribute the gifts speedily to the right addresses. Thus, some of our tanks got sledges and skis, while the valuable furs were often grabbed in the first place by the services behind the lines who, in any case, sat in warm Russian cottages. We helped ourselves as far as we could and requisitioned warm Russian sheepskins to give to our motorcyclists and grenadiers. To be unprepared for extreme cold had disastrous effects on our tanks and wheeled vehicles. The summer oil was too thin, and the cooling water froze at once. We were soon forced to thaw the water in the morning with blow lamps and procure hot water as soon as we got near a village. or else we had to leave the engines running throughout the night. No Western or Southern European or American can imagine what it means to fight in temperatures of 40 C below zero and in icy gauges. Since I myself reckon to be transferred sooner or later to North Africa, I asked Beck to see to the Mercedes, in which we intended to make the journey home of almost 2,000 kilometers. It was 2 days before Beck came back from a trip to the supply company. The front springs were gone, owing to the bad roads, he reported. With the workshop platoon, I forged some others for the time being and mounted them at nearly 40 C below. The car ought to stand up to the journey. Good old Beck, what would I have done without him? North of Yakroma, Russian ski units had filtered through between Klin and Kalinin and were threatening to cut us off. The bridgehead must be given up, said my divisional commander. We can't hold the front like this. You will disengage from the enemy in the coming night and cover the withdrawal of the division east of Klin on the main Moscow-Leningrad road. Our infantry units are going back to a new defensive position north and south of Volokolamsk, where the division, after fighting a delaying action, will be taken in. The general looked at me over his luck. This was to be expected. Hitler has overreached himself. Now we have got to pay for it, especially the poor infantry and the grenadiers. Give your men all the support you can. Many of them will get into a panic and try to save themselves at all costs. The disengagement and talk of retreat must and will succeed if we all keep our heads. We will lose a lot of material, but the main thing is to get the men back. In the hands of God, luck. Although catastrophe was looming, I could not grasp it. For the first time since the successful blitzkriegs, we were going back on disappointing terms. Snow, frost, icy winds, and an opponent who knew this climate and did not give up had defeated us. The comparison with Napoleon was inescapable. I could see the pictures in my history books of how the sad remnants of a proud army turned back and crossed the Beresina. The men, as well as most of our officers, were unaware of the full extent of what was happening. For them, other problems took precedence. How can I get my vehicle back in one piece? Will enough supplies come up? How can I protect myself against the barbaric cold? Hitler and Goebbels were still holding forth about the victorious Wehrmacht. My radio operator, who listened to the news now and then on shortwave, told me that our retreat was being represented as a straightening of the front. On the 3rd of December the retreat began. At the rear position at Volokolamsk, so it was said, feverish preparations were being made by the infantry. Little by little individual units of our division disengaged themselves from the Klin-Yakroma area. With my 2 battalions, I stayed on in the little town and around it. The Russians were not very active there. They preferred the way past us to the north and south. Finally, we too gave up the east bank of the Moscow-Volga Canal, while a large fan of reconnaissance tanks kept constant guard to the east, as far as the snow and the road conditions allowed. In great haste, 2 retreat routes had been cleared of snow. As a result, vast mountains of snow were piled high on either side of the road and made any divergence impossible. Except for intense reconnaissance activity, the enemy made no very strong direct pursuit of us. All the fiercer, however, were the attempts of the Russian Air Force to attack the backward movements with old biplanes and light bombers. Our own Air Force was hardly to be seen. The advanced airfields had apparently also been moved to the west, or else the cold and the snowstorms prevented their use. The effect of the enemy air attacks was devastating. Since no one on the retreat routes could escape, and since the Russians always came from the east, hence from behind, the infantry first caught the brunt of them. The next victims were the horse-drawn supply and artillery units. Before long, the narrow roads were choked with the cadavers of horses and broken-down vehicles. The men fought their further way, west on foot, and were often attacked in the flank by Russian ski patrols. Since we formed the rear guard, after a long interval, and since we were able to use our light anti-aircraft guns, we were not bothered so much. Once, however, we did come under air attack. Unnoticed and flying very low, some antiquated fighter aircraft crept up on us from behind. 2 shots passed between Beck and me and went through the windshield. We were lucky. West of the great Moscow-Leningrad highway, we too had to use the cleared routes. Only our tanks had made it trail here and there in the deep snow on either side of the roads, by which most of our track and half-track vehicles could circumvent the many obstacles. It was a grisly sight. Alongside dead horses lay dead and wounded infantrymen. "Take us with you or else shoot us," they begged. As far as space allowed, we took them on our supply vehicles to hastily organized field dressing stations. The poor devils. Protected against the cold with makeshift foot rags, they were now only a shadow of those who had stormed through Poland and France. Supplies got through to us only with difficulty, sometimes not at all. The truck drivers had to make their way against the stream of units flowing back. If they failed, there was suddenly no fuel. The best we could do then was to manage up our most important fighting vehicles. The others we had to destroy and leave behind. Man, horse, and truck by the Lord was struck. The saying here became a reality. Only the will to reach safety in the prepared positions kept the men going. Anything to avoid being left behind and falling into the hands of the Russians. Our divisional chaplain Martin Tarnow, in his notes last hours, has described the suffering and death of so many men. Voda water. Some wounded men lay in a kind of barn, among them a few Russians. In the face of death there were no longer any enemies. Again and again came the penetrating cry of a Russian, Voda. I gave him my water bottle. He drained it in one grateful swig. When I raised his blanket, I saw the blood-soaked bandage. A stomach wound, no hope. We could not understand each other, but suddenly he grasped my silver cross. Perhaps he too had a cross at home, hanging on the wall of his parents' house. I thought of Christ on the cross, who had once cried out, "Today shalt thou be with me in paradise." It was not long before his hand released my cross. He died very quickly. In dying, I believe he was consoled after weeks, which seemed to us an eternity, marked by shared misfortune and hardships endured. We came at last to the prepared position at Volokholamsk, which lay some 100 kilometers west of Moscow. We passed through the infantry positions to where we were to restore ourselves a few miles further to the rear. The primitive peasant huts seemed like luxury apartments to us. Utterly thankful to have escaped the infamo, we lay down on the oven beside the few remaining old inhabitants and wanted only one thing: sleep, sleep, sleep. The first reinforcements arrived, replacements who were better equipped for the severe Russian winter, vehicles, fuel, provisions that had long been lacking, and mail from home. This reminded us that Christmas, meanwhile, had come and gone, and that a new year had begun. What would 1942 bring for us? In the middle of January, I was summoned to the divisional commander. General von Funk received me in particularly friendly fashion. "Luck, 2 important bits of news for you. I had recommended you for the Knight's Cross. A few weeks ago, Hitler founded a new order, the German Cross in Gold, which ranks between the Iron Cross First Class and the Knight's Cross. All recommendations for the Knight's Cross have been converted. Yours too. In the name of the Führer, I have the honor to present you with this new order for bravery in face of the enemy." I was appalled, a large and clumsy star, with an oversized swastika in the middle of it, to be worn on the right breast. The general smiled. "Nice and impressive, isn't it? May I congratulate you all the same?" His words were full of irony. We at once coined a new name for this monstrosity, Hitler's fried egg. Except for headquarters visits, I never wore the order. Now for the second bit of news. Luck, you are being transferred with immediate effect to the Africa Corps to take over the 3rd Panzer Reconnaissance Battalion. I have to confess that this transfer has been on my table since November. I did not tell you or release you because you could not be spared in that decisive phase. Now Rommel is threatening me with the consequences if I don't send you on your way at once. I find it hard to let you go. In spite of our little differences, you were a great help to me as adjutant, and as a commander, you have been outstanding. Get everything ready. You can go in your beloved Mercedes. Report in the first place to personnel in Berlin. Drop in here just before you leave. An appropriate movement order will be issued by my adjutant. Thank you once again for everything and best wishes for the future. The news of my transfer came like a bombshell to my officers and men. We had, after all, fought together since the beginning of the war, shared joys and sorrows, and merged into a real team. The morale of the men had picked up again. Although conditions were no better, the days of rest had done some good nevertheless. I planned to leave on the 25th of January 1942. Beck had the Mercedes checked and procured supplies for several days, as well as reserve cans of fuel. As is usual among men, no one showed his feelings when we said goodbye. A few jokes passed between us, and then off to Divisional HQ, where I took my leave again, and was supplied with the movement order, Destination Berlin, Captain von Luck is to be given every assistance by all service posts. From my supply section, we collected mail for home, and from the doctor, I procured some Pervitin, a stimulant. The last person to whom I said goodbye was Staff Sergeant Kuschel, the RSM of my old company. I turned to Beck. We will drive without stopping until we were out of Russia. We will relieve each other every 100 kilometers, swallow Pervitin and stop only for fuel. After about 200 kilometers, we made our first stop for refueling at a supply unit. We were not authorized to issue fuel to individual vehicles, said a silverling, as we called the servicemen behind the lines because of the silver stripe on their arms. Listen, I replied, I will have fuel within 5 minutes if you value your life. Besides, the Russians have broken through in our sector and might be here by morning. I lied to him. Great excitement, and in a few minutes, I not only had fuel but also delicacies never seen at the front, such as a bottle of cognac, cigarettes, and tins of meat. We were disgusted by life behind the lines. The army supply units had soon been followed by the first-party functionaries, who took over civilian control and treated the population, who had often begun by greeting us as liberators, in the manner decreed by the party and propaganda minister Goebbels, as subhumans of an inferior race. No one took any notice of us when we appeared, tired and unshaven, in our white-painted car. Every village, every bridge was guarded by old, conscripted soldiers. Only once, when we produced our movement order yet again, did an old reservist ask me, "Sir, have you come from up there? How do things look? We hear nothing definite. I have a son in the infantry. For weeks my wife has had no news of him. Please tell me the truth, sir. We are very worried." I tried to give the old reservist some reassurance. From the region of Volokolamsk, we drove west along minor roads that had scarcely been cleared, so as to reach the Moscow-Minsk runway as soon as possible, along which progress would be easier. We could bear the artillery fire of both sides, which grew ever fainter with every mile we covered. And then, there was complete silence. No sound of battle, only a few supply vehicles moving east. Our journey was now almost romantic. We travelled across broad, snow-covered plains, through forests, deep under snow, and through deserted villages. The snowstorm that snatched at our heels covered our tracks in an instant. We drove with the top down to make it easier to spot Russian planes. Across his knees, Beck had a machine pistol at the ready. Everything seemed unreal to us. We were travelling through a virgin land that no one could grasp or possess. Beck and I were lost in thought and enjoying the peace. But we wanted to get on, to put a distance between ourselves and the gruesome experiences of the past weeks, to get out of that country in which we had to leave our comrades. Finally, we reached the runway. I had brought maps with us, of course, to avoid losing our way. We grew tired. Pervitin had to help, for we wanted to drive through the night. On the trail, traffic was brisker, and so brought us back to reality. The trail passed north of the cities of Vyazma and Smolensk. I resisted the temptation to revisit Smolensk Cathedral. In Smolensk, too, the Nazi functionaries would have made themselves at home. I decided to go back along the route we had used for our advance. On the one hand, it was familiar to me, and on the other, I was curious to see how things looked now. It was no great detour on the way to Berlin. We drove day and night, taking turns. North of Minsk, we left the trail for Vilnius, the capital of the former Baltic state of Lithuania, which had been pocketed by the Russians in 1940 as one of the Soviet republics, Hitler's present to Stalin for the non-aggression pact. The indicator showed that we had so far covered about 1,000 kilometers. We no longer knew, at that moment, how many days and nights it had been. Gradually, even Pervitin was no help. We were dog-tired and tried to overcome our fatigue by singing or telling each other stories. Beck Virius is not Russia. Lithuania is more part of Europe than of the East. We will just drive the remaining 200 kilometers and spend the night there. Now the snow-covered roads had been SM6 by traffic. The Mercedes ran without a sound and like clockwork. Eventually, late one afternoon, we reached our destination. As usual, there was a local German HQ. We came across an understanding reserve officer who assigned us a room in the Hotel Regina. We threw ourselves onto the beds. For the first time for 8 months, a bed and a bath. Only then did we realize that we were no longer at the Russian front. The strain of the past weeks began slowly to fall away. "Beck, we will have a bath now, shave off our stubble, and go to the restaurant for a meal. And then, we will have a really good sleep. As we entered the restaurant, we felt as though reborn. We thought we were dreaming. Officers of the base units were sitting at the tables with women, apparently leading a dolce vita. The little band could hardly make itself heard above the loud conversation. No one here, it seemed, wanted to know about the war. We bolted our food in disgust, handed in the voucher provided by HQ, and disappeared to our beds, lacking for so long. I woke late the following morning. Come on, Beck, we were going as fast as we can, on to Berlin. There's nothing to keep us here any longer. A further 600 kilometers lay before us. Finally, after 2 days, via Grodno, Warsaw and Posen, we reached Berlin. The Russian chapter was closed. The desert calls us Beck. Our first goal was replacement section 3 at Stahnsdorf near Berlin, our base until we left for Africa. The replacement sections were responsible for the training of soldiers to make up for losses at the front. They were also centers for the wounded and those on leave who were waiting for new postings. Officers and NCOs who, because of their wounds, were no longer fit for combat service as it was called, were employed as instructors so that their experience might be passed on. I reported to the CO of the replacement section, who was glad to see me. There you are at last. Rommel and the battalion have been waiting for you since November. You are to report at once to the personnel office. There you will receive movement orders and all information. First, they fixed us up with a bed for the night. I planned to go to the personnel office the following morning, but before that, I drove with Beck to the motor vehicle workshop. This Mercedes has survived the Russian campaign. Please check it over and remove the white camouflage paint. I will pick it up again if I come back from Africa. Beck, who was to be quartered in the barracks until our departure, would see to the car and watch over it with Argus eye. Early next morning, with a jeep and driver from the replacement section, I drove into Berlin. How the city had changed since I was last there. The people seemed cowed and dispirited. The news coming in from the Eastern Front, the air raids, which were becoming ever more frequent, life on ration cards, and the arrogant behavior of Nazi functionaries were sapping the vital energy of the Berliners, who were otherwise so quick-witted and full of zest for life. Air raid shelters of all sorts were to be seen here. At night, all the houses and streets are to be blacked out. Berlin seemed like a ghost town. Friends told me how they crouched night after night on their suitcases, containing their most important papers, an emergency pack by their side, ready to be summoned to the cellars by the raid wardens at the first warning. Gasoline was rationed. Private cars had almost disappeared. The Kurfürstendamm, once so pulsating, and Unter den Linden, were now given over almost entirely to the vehicles of notables, the Wehrmacht, and party organizations. At the personnel office, I found after much searching the head of the department responsible for North Africa. Welcome home. Now first of all, have a good rest and acclimatize yourself. Here's your allocation to a small hotel on the Kurfürstendamm, and an order to the Army Clothing Department for you and your orderly to draw your tropical equipment. Where do you want to spend your leave? I will have the appropriate movement orders made out, I protested vehemently. I know that I have been asked for by Rommel since November, but my divisional commander did not inform me or release me. I should like to go to Africa as quickly as possible. I know, he replied. Rommel's HQ has already been informed that you have only just got back from Russia and need a rest. Report to me at the end of March. On 1 April, you will be sent on your way. So, where do you want to spend the next 4 weeks? There was obviously nothing I could do about it, so I asked whether I could go for 2 weeks to my mother and 2 weeks to Paris. The officer smiled. Paris is not bad, he said. But things are not quite so simple. I must after all be able to justify the journey. I have a lot of friends there and know Paris from before the war. In addition, the city commandant is a former commander of our 7th Panzer Division, whom I would like to see again. That is fine. For a commander of Rommel's former division, we can certainly manage something. You can collect your movement orders tomorrow. So, as I really could not leave for Africa immediately, I made the best of the situation. When I got back to Stahnsdorf, I at once put in a request for 4 weeks' leave for Beck too. Before I went to my mother in Flensburg, which is on the border of Denmark, I wanted to see a few friends, of whom I had heard nothing since the outbreak of war. I went to Gisela von Schkopp. She was still living in Potsdam, where we used to be garrisoned. It was her marriage to dashing Bernhard, as he was called, that we had celebrated so light-heartedly at the manor house in fast Prussia. She told me that she had had no news of her husband for several weeks. He, too, was at the Eastern Front. We had a meal together and brewed some coffee from BMNs I had commandeered from a depot on the way back from Russia. But we had no time to enjoy it, for at that moment we heard the bark of the anti-aircraft guns and the wail of the air raid sirens. For the first time, I now shared the experience of an Allied air raid on our homeland. This is what it is like now, almost every night. "Come down to the cellar," Gisela called out to me. "No, I am not going into the cellar for anything. I feel better in the open air, where I can see what is happening. I can take cover if necessary, if bombs should fall even on Potsdam." I went outside. It was a lurid scene. The long white fingers of the searchlights probed the sky. In the distance, one could hear the drone of the bombers and the bark of the anti-aircraft guns. The raid was on Berlin, not Potsdam, which had no strategic significance for the enemy. I fetched Gisela from the cellar. "Come and see. What a spectacle. But how many houses will fall in ashes and rubble? How many innocent people will be buried in their cellars?" It dawned on me how much harder things were, in fact, for the civilian population in comparison to us at the front, for they were helpless and passive in face of the air raids. I understood also why our wounded, when they had recovered, were so keen to get back to the front as quickly as possible. I arranged meetings with the wives of my friends, who were all on active service. I gave them some real coffee from my supply. Coffee was more precious than gold, for all supplies were reserved for the troops. Civilians had to make ersatz coffee from barley or substitutes. As I was one of the first, apart from the wounded, who could give some account of the Eastern Front, I was questioned closely. To avoid disheartening my friends still further, I veiled the truth. The fate of these women moved me greatly. Many of them had married and started a family, and then their husbands had fallen. They had become widows without ever leading a proper married life. For that reason, I had resolved at the outbreak of war not to marry until the war was over. Although there had been bonds and relationships which made me think of marriage, I still kept to my resolution. The nightlife of Berlin had almost disappeared. Werner Fink, the great cabaret artist, still kept his catacomben open. But his biting humour was not to Goebbels' taste. He only avoided the threat of arrest because Hermann Göring had a weakness for him and arranged for him to be called up into the Luftwaffe. Despite all the pleasures of seeing my friends again, there was nothing to keep me long in Berlin, so I went to my mother's in Flensburg